Levantaré mi bandera, estando en mi país o estando allá afuera, porque para mí, mira, no existen fronteras. Yo levantaré mi bandera, wow. Levantaré mi bandera, estando en mi país o estando allá afuera, porque para mí, mira, no existen fronteras. No, no, y es que hay mucho sentimiento, lo grito al viento, de ser latino nunca me arrepiento. Lo digo desde la Suiza, centroamericana, rebota en Colombia y en Dominicana.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of the Latin Babbler Show. I am your host, the Latin Babbler, and I am joined today by Miss Rocky, Cecilia, and finally back on the show, El Bojique.
About time.
What's going on, fam? It's good to be back.
Our special guest today continues to be recognized widely for his work on NBC, CNN, The New York Times, Washington Post, NPR. He has written for the Marvel Comics critically acclaimed anthology, Guardians of the Galaxy, Tales of the Cosmos, recipient of the 2019 Comic-Con Humanitarian Award, benefit anthology for Reconstruction. Love that title. And now, the writer and creator of the critically acclaimed and best-selling superhero series, La Borinqueña, Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez. Welcome to the show.
Wepa, thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. The tremenda bulla. It's awesome.
Right?
Bienvenido.
Boricua's in the house. Let's
man,
go.
This is.
Yep.
Y la pandereta.
All right.
Hold up. I got my.
Uh-oh.
Oh, he had to make his own.
Uh-oh. Ah.
Hey.
Sí.
There you go.
Empezó la vaina.
Ahora empezó el show.
Ya empezó el show.
Ahora
Ya
fue
empezó el
que-
show. So, Edgardo, you were raised in the Bronx, like me, born in New Jersey. What was it like growing up there?
Well, truth be told, by the time I was 18, I lived in like 22 different places, including the Bronx, parts of Lower East Side, Washington Heights, Reading, Pennsylvania. I lived in Puerto Rico, Caguas, San Lorenzo, Ceiba, and Las Piedras, Syracuse. Formative years were in the South Bronx, where I spent a lot of time at the library. I'm a nerd. No surprise there. Grew up around the era when hip hop was really being developed. You know, block parties, DJ battling, sound systems, b-boys battling, and it was a
Cardboards.
Yeah, actually linoleum, because the cardboard is like, you know, might have staples in it. And a lot of my friends, they are pioneers in hip hop culture. Crazy Legs, Crash, one, mostly Boricuas, you know, from b-boys to DJs to graffiti writers. And I was the nerd. You know, I was the guy that loved and collected comics, drew comics for my friends, and saw the value of the storytelling that existed in comics. And it was an escapism for me, because I grew up during the crack era in New York City. You know, a lot of abandoned buildings. I survived an arson building. Literally, the building was burned, and I survived it. To this day, I still vividly remember my neighbor Winnie and her son Russell literally like waking us up in the middle of the night. Russell putting me piggyback and bringing me down the fire escape to save us from the fires. Living in the South Bronx neighborhood called Burnside, that was literally being burned. You know, so it was a very incredibly difficult time. There was a lot of abject poverty. There was a lot of lack of resources. At the time, there weren't these institutions that exist nationally that provide programs to young people in after-school settings, you know, in the areas of the arts. So children had to fend for themselves. Many of us were latchkey children. Many of us dealt with the realities of living in a community that was forgotten, you know, and that was a reality for us, but it didn't inhibit our creativity. So many of us flourished as illustrators, as dancers, as poets. You know, around that time was the era of the New York Poets Cafe, where a lot of incredibly successful and prolific poets came from that era. And so I was fortunate. You know, I was also raised in a Pentecostal household, incredibly conservative. So I was never tempted by the vices of life. You know, I never saw the necessity to be a part of any scenes. You know, I kept to myself, and like I like to say to a lot of my friends, I survived. I survived the Bronx.
Yeah.
You know?
South Bronx, South Bronx.
Right.
Word.
Yo, ironic. Everybody who I speak to who has grown up in the Bronx or has grown up in Brooklyn in that time frame says the same thing. We were there surviving. A lot of us, you know, had to be a part of projects in order to be able to like maintain our, you know, our way of life. Because if not, you would be lost to the streets or lost to whatever was going on. Like, it was crazy. You and I have kind of similar stories because, like, I was reading about you started at the Bronx, then you also went to eventually, like in your younger teens, you went to like Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
And I had the same thing. So I grew up in Patterson, which is kind of like the Bronx back in the 80s, you know.
And it was rough.
Yeah, it was rough. And then my mom, you know, sent us to the Dominican Republic. And that's where I like grew from my love of culture. Like, you go over there, it's completely different. Did you feel like that was the same way for you when you finally went back, you know, when you went to Puerto Rico and you got to live there and you saw the culture like in action? Because it's different, obviously, from New York to the island.
It wasn't, unfortunately for me, an impactful and kind of like lasting experience. I was in my early teens. I was a gifted, so quote unquote gifted academic student. And I was incredibly upset that we moved from New York City in the middle of the school year. You know, I already had plans. I was going to go to one of the most like academically rigorous high schools in New York City. I felt like I had options. I could either go to art and design, music and arts, Stuyvesant, all of these different schools. And my family pulled me out of that path. And I ended up in incredibly like rural parts of Puerto Rico, literally living the life of a jíbaro. And it was an incredible culture clash, shot a very much of a rude awakening for a child who grew up with the amenities and the luxuries of living in New York City. You know what I mean? And this is an era before the internet, before cable TV, but there was still a lot of amenities and luxuries that we had that weren't a reality when you lived in rural parts of Puerto Rico. You know, I have vivid memories chasing after cows. I had vivid memories spending time in El Rio with my dog just by myself. You know, I didn't really start connecting more to Puerto Rico during my time there until I started staying with my own biological family, because originally I was staying with stepfather's side of the family. So that was like your typical Cinderella story. You could literally embellish that in your imaginations. But when I started living with my biological family, like my tios, I started connecting to Puerto Rico in a way that really made a significant impact. My tío Joaquin really connected me to Puerto Rico in a very naturalistic and spiritual way. He was, como te digo, Christian, but his form of Christianity wasn't oppressive like the Pentecostalism that I grew up around. And his spirituality was very much communing with nature, with the earth. I recall as a child, like him literally telling me to stick my hand into the earth. In Ceiba, the earth was terracotta, so it's almost like clay-like. So also it was like, as an artist, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is clay. I can mold this into something, but also to give me that value. And I didn't realize it then that he was giving me a very real connection to my indigenous roots, my Taino connection, you know? And it would be years later that I would have like these synaptic reawakenings of those memories that would reconnect me to Puerto Rico and give me that longing to become one with Puerto Rico in a way that I wasn't able to do in my childhood.
Oh, that's good. So at what point did you, because what you did is you came back, you started Somos Arte.
Well, not after high school, but yeah.
Not after high school. I'm not saying after high school. I mean,
not after he chased the cow, he started in the studio.
Right after his uncle's house, you just went right in. But like, it was after that you decided you wanted to create that studio. What was the purpose of creating that type of studio?
Well, it was an opportunity for me to venture into entrepreneurism in an era where the dot-com bubble burst. There wasn't any certainty for careers. There wasn't any certainty for creators and creative people such as myself. And I also saw the opportunity to develop a design studio that was able to kind of like provide services in the areas of digital and print design. At the time, there was this kind of like transition between print and digital going in separate directions. And there were studios that just were amazing at print and brand new studios that were starting to understand what digital design was. And I was kind of like in the midst of both of them. And it's almost like that to me was an opportunity for me as a creative to not only work independently with clients, but to also possibly develop my own style, my own projects. I, with this studio, developed to become a curator. I created my own niche in the comic book industry, initially as an arts curator that started way back in 2007. I did 2 art shows with Marvel, and that was an opportunity for me to create my own, como te digo, level of respect and prestige in the industry without being an editor, writer, or illustrator, and creating a space that didn't exist in the comic book industry, which is one to celebrate the art and celebrate the artist creating it. One of my most successful shows was for Joe Quesada, who's presently Marvel's chief creative officer, overseeing everything from publishing to TV to film. And at the time, he was editor-in-chief of the comic book publishing division. You know, Cubano from Jackson Heights, who grew up in an incredibly diverse community, created a team of superheroes inspired by his mother's faith in the Orishas. And he shared with me that never in his career had he had an opportunity to be celebrated as an artist. So I literally gave him the first solo art show of his entire career. And that kind of gave me an opportunity to connect in the comic book industry on my terms. And that's what Somos Arte provided for me. It provided me the space to be autonomous. It provided the space for me to be a maverick in a way, to be able to develop my own thing without having to be supervised by a board or supervised by a director of a larger company. I was my boss, you know, and I had the opportunity to really develop a brand. And, you know, 20 years later, here we are. Now we're publishing comics.
Yeah. And nice. You got, what is it? You're working with Daryl DMC McDaniels from Rum DNC?
That was actually my first foray into publishing. So I started working with Daryl 9 years ago and published a trilogy of graphic novels with him. Once I concluded that graphic novel series with him, I moved on to other projects. Concurrently working with Daryl McDaniels, I was also working with John Leguizamo. I worked on John's first comic book series, which was an adaptation of his award-winning play Freak, and recently just wrapped a 4-issue series with John that was published by Image Comics under the support of Todd McFarlane, and that's Phenomics. And the 4th issue literally just came out last week for that series. So that opportunity of working with celebrities who already had an established brand, an established audience, gave me the space to work on a project that already had a level of success kind of built in, because they already had a guaranteed audience, right? But that also gave me the publishing experience, because up until that point, I have had and continue to have the experience as a creative director, producing and executing projects and campaigns for clients. But I never had the opportunity to actually publish and produce books. So working with Daryl McDaniels, working with John Leguizamo gave me the experience and the confidence to eventually do our own self-publishing with La Borinqueña.
Oh, very cool. All right, so let's get into the comics. So it's being featured everywhere. And some of these reviews are absolutely amazing. So CNN, La Borinqueña uses her powers to reconstruct Puerto Rico. You got Al Dia, rebuilding Puerto Rico with comics. You got CBC, comic book superheroes are coming to Puerto Rico's aid. It's featured in the New York Times, Entertainment Weekly, Noticel, Nerdist, which is probably your favorite magazine since you're Sci-Fi Wire, The Inquirer, Daily Mail. I mean, the list goes on. Who is the character La Borinqueña?
La Borinqueña is Marisol Rios de la Luz. She's a fictional character that I created, inspired by a lot of the research that I did. According to the Pew Research Foundation, there is a trend here in the United States where Latinas are embracing science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, STEAM, more than any other generation. So I wanted to create a character that reflected this trend, this positive movement in our community. But I also wanted to create a student, because as a student, from a storytelling perspective, they're a vessel that can be filled with so much knowledge, with so much experience, with so much life. And when you have the opportunity, many of us don't, but when you have that opportunity to go away to school, most of us arrive at school with this ideology of ourselves that's really shaped by our parents and shaped by our family. But when we're away, we finally get to figure out who we are on our own terms. And by making her a student that lives in Puerto Rico and is now studying in Puerto Rico, she comes from the diaspora. And there's 6 million of us living across the United States and 3 million in Puerto Rico. And, you know, over the last 10 years, according to the Census Bureau, that population has increased by 500,000 because of the debt crisis, because of Hurricane Maria, and because of many other social issues. So bringing this fictional character to Puerto Rico was a deliberate storytelling vehicle that allowed me to immerse the viewer, the reader, in a reality that's inspired by the reality of Puerto Rico, and giving the reader an opportunity to kind of experience Puerto Rico through the eyes of this young student. She's Afro-Latina, she's asthmatic, she's a science student, and she's well, como te digo, a single child from 2 parents, and she is incredibly connected to her family. One of the main reasons why she goes to Puerto Rico is not only to continue her undergraduate studies, but to also help out her abuelos, who are now retired and running their own cafe in Rio Grande. And as a typical child of a Latin family, she's there to help. So she's working super early hours in the morning in the kitchen, getting the food and ingredients prepped for the day, and then shooting off to do her independent studies so that she can fulfill her credits. So that's who La Borinqueña is. It's in essence, it's a student by the name of Marisol Rios de la Luz.
Very cool.
That is awesome. So, Edgardo, first of all, I want to applaud the fact that you picked a female superhero lead, but I also would like to know what made you pick a female superhero lead.
Well, I think you have to even like dissect that question, right? Because I think if it was El Borinqueño, I don't think that you would have even asked me that question. Because we're conditioned living in a patriarchal society here in the United States, and for the most part, most of the planet, right? We're conditioned to question when a woman is taking the lead. We're conditioned to question the validity and the authenticity of a protagonist being a woman. When I created this character, she was inspired by the incredibly powerful women in my life. I was raised by a single mother. I was raised by my tia. I was raised by multiple madrinas who are lawyers, founders of museums, university professors. These are the women that shaped my identity in my life. And as a child, when I dug my hand into that earth in Ceiba, Puerto Rico, I recall pidiendo la bendición to the earth. Like I always knew and felt that Puerto Rico was a connection to this divine feminine energy, you know, and it would be years, decades later that I would learn of the Taino mysticism and mythology of Atabed, the mother goddess, the mother Semi of the Tainos. And creating La Borinqueña allowed me to not only affirm the women in my life, but also allowed me to kind of do a deep dive into Puerto Rico's history, from as far back as Atabed to the creator of the first original flag of Puerto Rico, la Bandera de la República de Puerto Rico, the lattice flag, which was created by Mariana Bracetti, the first lyrics to La Borinqueña written by Lola Rodriguez de Tio, a 24-year-old poet at the time, the second notable flag of Puerto Rico, which is actually originally with a light blue triangle, which was created by Mimi Besosa here in New York City, and seeing this long trajectory of women that were part of the shaping of Puerto Rican culture, history, art. One of the most prolific poets in Puerto Rico was an Afro-Puerto Rican by the name of Julia de Burgos. The founders of public education in Puerto Rico were Gregoria and Celestina Cordero and their brother Rafael, mira para allá, Tocayo. They founded the public school system in Puerto Rico soon after freeing themselves from slavery. So there was this trajectory of the incredible role that women have had in our culture. And I think looking at Puerto Rico as a microcosmic example of what the rest of the world is like. And unfortunately, living in a patriarchal society with men ruling the society, we write history. We erase history. The role of women is significantly disregarded, not mentioned, and for the most part, even omitted. You know, so I think that with La Borinqueña, it's an opportunity to reaffirm and reevaluate and then celebrate the feminist energy that is naturally a part of our culture and our heritage.
And even the word history.
Mira para allá.
I love everything about that answer.
You're taking
Oh
us
my
to
God.
class. Seriously, like you're taking us to
Right.
school with that one.
Bueno, I'm always
Seriously.
You should
Absolutely.
see
You never stop
at the dinner
learning.
table with our sons, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah, I have a 12-year-old daughter, so this is gonna be awesome for her to hear. You know.
Thank you.
Now, back in my day, remember the comic strips, the newspaper. That was my first time ever really seeing the comic, the comic strips back then, right? But I wanted to know what made you realize you wanted to create a comic series, especially a multicultural series.
Well, I decided to get into comic book publishing because I realized it's an American art form of storytelling that is very accessibly attainable with a very limited budget. You know, I love animation, I love live action, film and television, but we're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to get something of significant value, because we all know our minds and our eyes have been trained to be snobs at production value. And then if the CGI is off, if the set design is whack, if the car is the wrong model,
True.
We're like, una porquería,
Yeah.
click, you know what I mean? So with comics, it's something that kind of like levels the storytelling playing field significantly, right? The production value in comics is limited by the talent that you bring in to actually work on the comics, right? So one of the things I set out to do when I started publishing La Borinqueña was I was very well aware that there were Puerto Ricans in the comic book industry for decades. The very first Puerto Rican to draw comics was Alejandro Schomburg, who used to draw Captain America in the 1940s. The most prolific artist in comic books is George Perez, Puerto Rican from the South Bronx, who created close to 70 different characters between Marvel and DC. And although there's an incredible amount of like Latinx artists behind the scenes, we're not represented on the pages or in the panels. So I took like my own roster and I was able to handpick talent that was available because for the most part in the comic book industry, these are all freelancers. To this day, the majority of people that create comic books are freelance artists who are developing stories and art as a work for hire. So they don't even own these properties that they work on. And in the collection of the work that exists, there aren't actually Latin stories that are being produced by Latin people in the mainstream comics. For all intents and purposes of recognizing how amazing Miles Morales is with the Spider-Verse, it was created by a Jewish American by the name of Brian Michael Bendis. As much as people love going into the Black community on Black Panther, it was developed also by two Jewish Americans, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. So with La Borinqueña, it was an opportunity to say, here's comic books. Here's something that's more accessible for me as the head of my own design studio to bring in professionals and give the book the same level of quality that is published by these multi-billion-dollar publishing companies. And I have artists that work on La Borinqueña who currently are working on mainstream books with Marvel and DC at the same time. So when you look at the production value of our books, the artwork, and then as a designer myself, I know about print production. So I know how to select paperweight. I know how to select binding. I know how to literally observe the production of a book and the weight of a book. I know how to give the book the physical value so that when you hold that graphic novel in your hand, muchas veces la gente dicen, oye, like they're like weighing like a piece of chicken at the butcher shop. Este está bueno. Esto me lo llevo. Dame dos de este. You know what I mean? So it's like that, that level of value.
For
so
real.
that's why I got into making it in comics. And in terms of the storytelling, if you've seen the books of La Borinqueña, she takes you all over Puerto Rico. There could be a cast of like dozens, if not hundreds of people if it's a scene of a political demonstration or an intergalactic scene when she's interacting with Atabex in another dimension. I mean, caramba, that's like that right there. That's like 6 figures to recreate that in a film, to do that kind of level of CGI. But in comics, it's like, just tell the artist to work on it, give them extra time if the pages are very intricate and complex. And that's why. And, comic books, for the most part, inspired the multi-billion-dollar movie industry that exists now. And it's the source material, And the thing is, like, from a very, analog perspective, there's nothing more satisfying than physically holding a book, than passing it along to somebody else. And something I do want to point out, Rocky, is that the largest demographic of readers for La Borinqueña are women. And and the reason is because women have been underrepresented in the comic book industry. Not to say that women don't want to read comics. Women do want to read comics, but they're tired of seeing themselves over-sexualized, sensationalized, objectified, being one on a team of 20. You know what I mean? It's like when you create a book, I took all of that into consideration. You know, I was in my 40s when I started making La Borinqueña, so this wasn't some like, you know, prepubescent fantastical development in my mind. This was a book that was developed by a father, by the founder of the studio. So there was a lot of deliberate intention went into making it into a comic book series, and that's why. And comic books, because in the last 10 years or so, there's been a significant academic movement of accepting and authenticating graphic novels as literature in classrooms. So there are schools across the United States, from elementary to graduate schools, that are now teaching La Borinqueña in classrooms, along with other graphic novels. And that's something that can be done and could not be done if it wasn't for the fact that it existed as a physical book.
Oh, and something that we do around here, we actually smell those books.
Word or not?
There's something about smelling of, you know, getting into it and smelling it and feeling the texture of the pages is something else.
Absolutely.
And also, I was going to say that, interesting that you said that Schomburg, right? I didn't know this. That Schomburg had actually designed Captain America, and I've been saying for years that he was Puerto Rican.
That
He didn't
Schomburg?
He didn't design. That was Kirby. But Kirby was just before Schomburg. But Schomburg came right after Kirby, and Schomburg is also credited. If you know the cartoon series Futurama, there's a robot on that character called Bender. Bender is inspired by the science fiction covers that Alejandro Schomburg used to paint in the 1950s, because he was a pulp fiction artist. So he made all of these covers. And I'll share with you a quick little anecdote. I'm friends with Rubén Blades, and Rubén Blades is a huge comic book fan, has an incredible collection of original art and comics. And one of the first nights he and I were hanging out, I started talking about Schomburg, and he goes, espérate. Tú me estás diciendo a mí que Alex Schomburg es boricua. And I'm like, yeah. Tú me estás diciendo a mí que yo tengo en mi casa pintura original de Alex Schomburg, de un boricua. I'm like, yeah, bro, you do. So that was kind of dope that I got to like school Pedro Navaja on some comic book stuff.
Right.
You know?
And I was gonna, Edgardo, I saw a post in which you were thanking Rosario Dawson, who has been a huge support, right? And on your last issue, it features her. How did you guys connect?
Well, our connection started, caramba, way back in 2016. Y era pura coincidencia. We were literally on one of the side streets of the Puerto Rican Day Parade in New York City, which runs up Fifth Avenue. But all the side streets, like all the numeric streets, are the staging areas. So there'll be like anywhere from like 5 to 10 floats in each one of those streets. And you're just chilling, you're just waiting. And when they say, vamos, vamos, it's your turn to join the parade, they open up the barricades and then the floats roll out. Rosario was in our street. We did a very quick exchange. I remember I was with a young woman who was dressed as La Borinqueña. Did a quick like, hey, my name is Edgardo, pa, 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 pa. It was seconds long, right? The next time we would connect was during this time where I went through my my X-Men cerebral phase, right? Cerebro phase, where I was kind of like seeking out all the Puerto Rican mutants that were making comics. And one of the artists that I was able to connect with was Gustavo Vasquez, who it turns out is her uncle. So he immediately was like, and as we're working on stuff, he said, you know, my nieces, right? And I'm like, how am I supposed to know about your family? And then out of that conversation, I learned that Rosario and him are family. He connects me to her through our work. And eventually she starts like rocking the La Borinqueña button, like showing off her La Borinqueña book that her uncle drew. And then when Hurricane Maria hit, less than a year after the first book debuted, one of the first people that reached out to me personally was Rosario Dawson. Like she literally got my number from Gustavo and was like, look, I need to know what I can do to be a part of whatever you're gonna do for Puerto Rico. And she wrote an original story for La Borinqueña for that book. That was Reconstruction. That's the book that we did with Wonder Woman on the cover, this book right here. And she did an original story. And what's beautiful about that story that she wrote is that her uncle illustrated it for her, which was amazing, right? And we've been doing work with Rosario off and on over the last 6 years. Recently, we actually produced a series of public service announcements where La Borinqueña was animated. And she was engaging Latinx voters across the United States to register to vote. You know, last general election in 2020, you saw the most the largest number of Latinx voters in the history of the United States. And we were like one little granito de arena that contributed to that success. And Rosario was the voice of La Borinqueña when we animated the the public service announcements. And then she brought in her homegirl. She brought in her homegirl Zoe Zaldana to do the voice of La Borinqueña in Spanish. And then we lastly, in 2020, we produced this record, right? This is our version of Que Bonita Bandera. And this was actually released as a vinyl record, and it came in a comic book. That was actually Rosario's first appearance in an actual comic book. And we did a music video for it. And in the music video, she performed in the music video along with Rosie Perez, along with Lori Hernandez, Freddie Rodriguez, Ramon Rodriguez, Modesta Lacen, Jamie Osorio, Eddie Palmieri, Tony Touch, Crazy Legs, so many different artists, right? And now we got her teaming up again. This time she's going to be in the whole book, teaming up alongside La Borinqueña.
Nice. So then you have, Rosario Dawson, Afro-Latina, La Borinqueña, Afro-Latina. I'm an Afro-Latina. But you forgot something. She's got a Chinese Dominican best friend.
That's right.
What made you decide on that background for her best friend?
Well, I had an opportunity to collaborate with the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center back in 2016. Right when I was still in production of my first book, I was already being invited to speak at museums and universities, and I didn't even have the first book done yet. And I had this opportunity to be a part of this show that was going to be presented in New York City's Chinatown. And so I was like, this is a great opportunity for me to introduce one of our new characters. And they told me I didn't have to change anything in my book, so even created anything original. Now, I come from an Asian Latinx family. My wife is Korean American. Our sons, we refer to them as Coricuas, because we have a Korean household, right? Everything,
that's cool.
Everything from kimchi to pasteles, you know what I mean?
Yes,
listen, I had some Japanese Dominican friends in high school, and that was bananas to see them and then hear them speaking Dominican, more Dominican than a regular Dominican. Yeah. It was crazy.
Yeah, and that's the thing about
born and raised in Santo Domingo.
And that's the thing about developing this character. I recognize what you just pointed out. In Santo Domingo, you have the largest concentration of Chinese immigrants. They even have at the Barrio Chino in the Dominican Republic, right? And what's amazing about Barrio Chino in the Dominican Republic, and also Chinatowns across the world outside of China, is that culturally they've through entrepreneurism, through faith, through family, have maintained their culture and language for generations. And one of the things that's important to point out is the why. Because when the Chinese Exclusion Act was introduced in the late 1800s here in the United States, which was like one of the first like xenophobic laws that were passed in the United States, right? History, that did not stop the immigration of Asians into the Americas. So the U.S. closed its borders to bringing in Asians, and everyone else was like, ven pa acá. So Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos came out through the rest of Latin America. And you're looking at like anywhere from 2 to 4% of Latin American population are of Asian descent, right? We're talking hundreds of thousands of people. We're not talking to like 2 or 5 people. Exactly. And so, and we're not just talking about like a mix of people that son como Dominicano Chino or Cubano Coreano. Some families are like generations like pure Asian, and they speak completely fluent Spanish. I grew up in New York City, going to a lot of Cuban Chinese restaurants. I thought it was normal for people who were Asian to speak Spanish. I thought it was normal. ¿Qué tú quieres comer? Yo quiero tostones con lo mein. Okay, chévere. ¿Y tú quieres mojito por encima? And now, with a Cuban accent. No te preocupes, hacer it,
Instagram reels where they have that, where you see like this Asian person walk in and then the guy is like, oh, he's trying to translate, thinking that the guy speaks, some type of Chinese or something like that. And then he gets to the counter and he's ordering everything, croquetas, everything that you could possibly think of. And it's catching the Dominican off guard, like, whoa, hold on a second. He's like, es que yo soy dominicano, papá. And he's still
And that's why we created our Chinese Dominican Asian Latina character, Lala Leu, right? Because one of the things I want to do as a storyteller, first is my story, so I get to tell the story and I get to create the characters that I want to create. So I literally was like, I'm going to showcase the most underrepresented parts of our Latin heritage, right? Afro-Latins and Asian Latins, right? And to show ourselves, but also show the rest of the world that we're not this homogenous like people. You know what I mean? If it's up to Hollywood, we'd all look this color or whiter. You know what I'm saying? And we have Right, we have this absorbed mentality of Eurocentric standards of beauty that also supersedes Hollywood because it's part of all our novelas. And whenever you see darker complexioned people in novelas, unless it's a novela about Celia Cruz, you're never going to see actual Afro-Latins as the leads of these novelas. You see what I'm saying? So La La Leo is a celebration of an extended celebration of the diversity of our Latin heritage and how diverse it is. And, we're an ethnic group. Many of us who get passionate say, somos la raza, pero la realidad es, somos todas las razas. We're everything. We're indigenous, we're African, we're Asian, we're European. We have all of that. 23andMe should be called 23-2 because it's like we literally represent the DNA gene pool of the planet.
Let's go, Professor.
Con mi arroz frito.
No, I have a very important question, Edgardo. If La Borinqueña could cross over to another comic universe, would it be Marvel or DC?
Well, La Borinqueña actually has her own universe, so people are crossing over into her universe. And one of the things I learned about working with DC Comics, which is an incredible opportunity that I can only equate to letting you play with somebody else's like toy chest of action figures. It was one of the most amazing experiences, most talented, most supportive team of people I've ever worked with creatively in my life. Everything from editors to artists to writers to attorneys who worked pro bono with us from Warner Brothers, and working with Dan DiDio, who at the time was one of the co-publishers of DC Comics. One of the things that I learned from him is how you can navigate copyrights and trademarks, right? And we're aware of this, but we're not aware of this. It's used all the time. In movies and books, they are constantly name-dropping characters that are not part of their universe. Because you can do that. You can name-drop. As long as you don't show them in the actual book or in the actual movies, then that's obviously a trademark infringement, right? Or copyright infringement. So I can actually, in the last book, we published, well, this book is a crossover, right? The DC universe crossed over to Puerto Rico. Because in their 80-year canon, they have never created stories that brought these characters to Puerto Rico. And for the first time, they came to Puerto Rico. So everything in this book is canon in La Borinqueña stories. So we actually mention Wonder Woman, we mention Batman, we mention all these other characters. We don't show them anymore because we don't have the copyright permission or trademark permission, pero they're canon to us. So she's already crossed over. And maybe she'll cross over to other universes, or rather, maybe they'll cross over to us. But it's part of the collaborative work that we do that allows us to create these the opportunities to really push forward our advocacy, activism, and philanthropy.
And Edgardo, talking about name dropping, right? This was interesting. When I saw this, I was like, what? Really? I got to ask him this question. So, okay, fam. I really want to know, what was it like to meet Iris Morales from the Young Lords?
Iris Morales is my madrina. I've known Iris since I was like 19. She's 18 or 19.
Wow, nice.
She's literally like, that's the attorney. When I name dropped all those like women that were my madrinas, she's one of them from the beginning. She's mentored me, she shaped me, she's called me out like a mom would and should. I call her mom. She introduces me to people as her son. She gave me my first professional gig.
That's so awesome.
She gave me my first professional gig. I was actually a creative artistic director for her documentary, Pa'lante Siempre Pa'lante. I mean, ¿qué sabía yo? I was like 20-something, like fresh out of college. And here I was working with her. And she's a part of my life to this day, And I'm who I am today because of the influence and the impact that she's had in my life. So Iris is and will always be my madrina. She's my mentor.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, the hard work with the Young Lords and everything else and everything that they did in the community, even in the midst of, like what you were saying, the drug era and stuff like that, and what they did for the community and as it relates to programs and really, just making things happen in the community.
She's amazing. The work that she was a part of and the work that she continues to be a part of, because what's important to point out is that the Young Lords were a blip in her life. She's in her 70s now. She did Young Lords for maybe like 2 or 3 years, maybe, and it's like the work that she's committed to, it's been a life of social justice. And that's what's inspired me. In fact, our philanthropic work in Puerto Rico started because of Iris. She was in Puerto Rico immediately after Hurricane Maria on the ground, meeting with activists, meeting with leaders of community organizations across the island. She came back to New York, was sitting in our living room, having a meal with us, and said, I have a spreadsheet of all these organizations that I've already personally vetted. So whenever you're ready, I will introduce you to these organizations. And that was the groundwork that helped us establish our La Borinqueña grants program.
Nice. That's awesome.
So I know you're really on tour, and I know that a lot of what you do on tour, obviously, besides promoting the comic, is you're big on social issues, especially social political issues in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is kind of a weird country. It's one of those things where it's like, we're part of the United States, but we're really not, so to speak. We have our own patria. We have our own symbolism. We celebrate Puerto Rican culture, but we're not represented in the United States. So it's kind of we're kind of like in between. We're not really grasped. And so we had one of the audience, I had put out, we're gonna interview Edgardo. And they were like, okay, they have a very important question. I thought it was a very good question because of the nature of the comic. So we had a person who asked, is La Borinqueña pro-state or sovereignty? Will this be addressed in any upcoming issue?
La Borinqueña is pro-Boricua. That is what she is. She is not pro-American. She is not pro-statehood. She's not pro-independence. She's not pro-colony. She's pro-Boricua. She's a student who is discovering herself. And through discovering herself, she's making her own decisions. Now, me personally, as a U.S. resident of New York City, right? I personally don't want to also articulate my personal opinion on the status of Puerto Rico because I believe that in and of itself is a colonial statement. Because I'm living in the comfort and luxury of being in New York City, and here I am, I think Puerto Ricans should X, Y, and Z, fill in the blank. I believe that Puerto Ricanos in Puerto Rico should have the autonomy and the voice to decide for themselves. And as the U.S., we should respect what they want for themselves, because there are 3 million Puerto Ricanos on the island who have a voice, who have nationalism, who have pride, and they should be able to decide for themselves. And on the flip side of that, as a colony, the world's oldest colony at 123 years, they still continue to be associated with the United States. So a la misma vez, we have to be like, espérate, there's still resources that are still due to Puerto Rico. So in this state of limbo that Puerto Rico continues to be, the United States still needs to recognize its responsibility to Puerto Rico. So right now there's $10 billion that have been designated by FEMA to be assigned to Puerto Rico. That's an example of the kind of resources that the United States should be responsible for. It's also important to understand that a law like the Jones Act needs to be repealed. As someone as conservative and as an icon for the Republican Party as Senator John McCain was, before he passed away, he was trying to pass legislation to repeal the Jones Act because he saw how much of a crime that was. In fact, it's important to point out that a significant portion of the Floridian economy is fueled by the Puerto Rican economy, because Puerto Rico pays a tariff every time a cargo ship arrives to Gainesville, Florida, to unload everything from iPhones to lunchboxes that come internationally, right? Yeah, and produce that's actually not produced in Puerto Rico, it's shipped to Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico has to pay a tariff, and that tariff goes into the Floridian economy. Y nadie habla de eso. So it's this interesting space. So I think that what La Borinqueña does, she represents Boricua heritage, Boricua culture, and she represents the need and necessity for us as a people to learn about our heritage, learn about ourselves, and to advocate for ourselves. She teaches us to empower our voice. And when you have an empowered voice, then you should use that to whatever ends. I think as someone who lives here in the U.S., I strive to empower the voice of Puerto Ricanos on the island so that their voice is heard, so that there's an audience for them here in the United States. I applaud the work of Congresswomen Nydia Velázquez and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are trying to pass the decolonization bill and here in the United States. That is one of the most important bills. And that's one thing in Puerto Rico that all parties agree on. From the Partido Popular, the Independentistas, to PNP, they're like, decolonize Puerto Rico. And that's my position. And also, La Borinqueña is fictional. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's
well, you
like,
know, I
Good
asked,
one. Good one.
character
Yeah.
with a blue
I
cape.
asked,
You know what I mean?
I asked the
So-
question because it comes, comes from a fan. So
Yeah.
they asked the question
But I
because they
think-
were
I
like,
think-
okay,
I think when people read the book, and I think that's the most important thing, there's a lot of recognizability that the character has, but I'm very aware that the majority of the people that are aware of La Borinqueña are not reading La Borinqueña. And when you actually read her stories, you understand Puerto Rico and you understand the story that we're trying to tell. But you can't make a statement, you can't make an assumption just on the cover of the book.
just on the
Literally.
cover. Yeah.
Literally can't do that. You really can't do that. You have to really immerse yourself into the narrative that's been developing over the last 6 years to say, oh, and understand if there's a narrative there. Also, it would not be studied at universities from the University of Puerto Rico to MIT. There's a reason why universities are studying these books. And if you're making an assumption just based on an image that's gone viral on social media, bueno, that's only.
I mean, that's the era we live in, though.
Yeah, and I think it's a responsibility of us to kind of go beyond the social media posts and actually see what are the underlying layers under that.
Agreed. Very much agreed, bro. This was actually a really good interview. Like I felt like, I always tell everybody I'm a student first. I was literally a student this entire interview. I mean,
The history lesson
statistics,
professor.
which is like I'm a huge fan of statistics, so I'm glad you did them before I did them. So it's just really good. Look, in our case, I was honored because I feel like La Borinqueña is going to be something that's going to bring the voice of Puerto Rico like to resonate really loud, and not just from the island, but into the United States, to a way where we start getting the respect and the recognition that we deserve as being a part of the United States. Because there's just so much that's taking place now where we get kind of marginalized and compartmentalized, even though we're a huge part of the culture that's not just there, but here.
Exactly.
So I'm glad that this comic is bringing to life, that culture, that mentality with a great story. Like Cecilia was said, a female character. I know that what we're talking about is society, from a society standpoint. There's that joke about the doctor who's saving their son and everybody just assumes the doctor is a man. And they completely forgot about the mom who could be a surgeon as well. So, Edgardo, if people wanted to follow you or purchase the upcoming copy of La Borinqueña, with the guest Rosario Dawson, where do they go? Can they do it online, or is it just at the comics?
You can start at our website. If you go to la-borinquena.com, that's like our digital headquarters. You'll learn about our philanthropic work in Puerto Rico. You can listen to podcasts where I talk more about the book. You can purchase the books, and you can also find a link to actually pre-order the new book that's coming out, La Borinqueña, guest starring Rosario Dawson, which is our opportunity to really engage in a conversation around climate change and using Puerto Rico as a model to say que aquí se hace mejor, meaning that in Puerto Rico, we can literally create a global model for what transitioning to renewable energy could look like. And I think one of the most important things about this $10 billion FEMA budget that's there is that we need to raise awareness so that people in Puerto Rico get the support that they need so that these funds that are made available, particularly as reparations after Hurricane Maria, are dedicated to making Puerto Rico a sustainable island, a sustainable nation that can literally become much more self-sufficient and also prove to be a model for the rest of the world of what a modern society can actually look like that's run by Puerto Ricans.
Puerto Ricans.
Galo for president. You got my vote.
Amen.
All right.
That's so awesome.
Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez, thank you so much for joining us
Thank you,
here on the
Edgardo.
Latin Babbler
It's
Show.
an honor.
That is our show, folks. You got to listen. Neighborhood Radio, Saturday at 5 on radio89.com and on literally every podcast network that you go and look for. Follow us on social media. The platform is at Latin Babbler Show. Visit our website, www.latinbabbler.com. We will have a link for you to purchase the comic along with this interview on that website. I'm the Latin Babbler, along with Edgardo, along with Cecilia and El Bojique and Ms. Rocky, and we are out.
Desde Nicaragua hasta Costa Rica, con esta canción todo el mundo se identifica. Llamen a los chilenos y a los cubanos, llamen a Puerto Rico y a los mexicanos, que ya se armó la rumba. Desde Panamá hasta Ecuador, vámonos a Perú y luego hasta Salvador. Que se escuche en Brasil y Argentina. Yo quiero un grito de mi gente latina y levantaré mi bandera, estando en mi país o estando allá afuera, porque para mí, mira, no existen fronteras.